Hello everybody, my name is Carlos Alvarez and I want to thank you for taking the time to click on my presentation. As we can see, my presentation topic is going to be on supplying the armies, and I'm going to be taking the supply and logistic approach. So the core idea, or in other words the thesis, is through the historical lens it has become evident that the Union had an advantage that ultimately helped and won them the Civil War. The South were inadequately supplied, left with somber attempts in hopes to equip themselves with well-needed provisions. The North didn't face these problems. Though both economies evolved at their own pace, in their own trajectory, the North had efficiently revolved around factories and railroads. Being well equipped became a huge reason that the Union won the Civil War. So first we're going to be looking at more than battles won and bullets fired, and why logistics and overall provisions mattered. So, in the History Is Now magazine, it states the Confederate government faced myriad interconnected problems that hindered its ability to adequately plan for and address the logistical challenges during the American Civil War. The magazine commences with identifying the problems the Confederacy faced, logically concluding their lack of provisions was a challenge they endured to properly equip themselves for mission success. In addition, the magazine also mentions the Confederacy was newly established, with an obvious absence of well-established bureaucracy and logistics system. As a result, the Confederacy were losing credibility through lack of provisions. As the magazine also states, the network became increasingly unable to supply the needs of its armies in the field, which led to their inability to not only win the Civil War, but to adequately participate. So now we're going to be looking at the war within the war, a comparative analysis of Civil War logistics. So the essential Civil War curriculum essay of supplying the armies evidently states the challenge the Confederacy faced based on lack of essentials. The essay states the Confederacy had to establish the infrastructure and procedures of its procurement, transportation, and distribution activities from scratch. That challenge was much more difficult than the one the Union faced. While the lack of essential supplies has clearly been a problem for the Confederates, the Union was thriving with their revolvement around them. The essay also states the Union Army demonstrated the ability to use wagon trains, railroads, and river steamboats to transfer both men and equipment to any targeted location with an appropriate military objective. As demonstrated, the Union also dominated the logistical planning of attacks and maneuvers due to their advantage of supplies. These comparisons reveal challenges the Confederacy faced and advantages the Union faced. Now we're going to be looking at supplying the fighting, the importance of being well equipped. So, while this article closely reflects the previous one, as it is the same name and the same author, this version explicitly adds the idea that being well equipped directly relates to being ready for a war. This article presents the Confederate supply agency's inability to meet the material needs of a field army impacted the ability of field commanders to pursue the most appropriate military objective. Essentially, the lack of provisions disallowed the Confederacy to follow through, or follow up, as stated in this article, attacks, specifically on the Union's capital, Washington, D.C. The article also mentions the Confederacy's failed attempts with poor planning, stating they continue to deal with each individual logistical problem without developing any comprehensive program. Their inability to use not only all of their resources, but using them wisely, affected their ability to prepare for battles, ultimately reflecting their preparation for the war. So now I'm going to be looking at the war on advocacy, essentially the war on support, and the response of the home front. So through an Ohio State University study known as the War Materials, Armies, Civilians, and the Struggle for Resources During the American Civil War by Joan Cashin, presents another idea where both armies additional efforts to supply themselves led to civilians on both sides being negatively effective. The article states the Union troops weren't the only ones forcibly taking food from Southern civilians. Cashin argues Confederate troops did the same, as well as destroying food to keep it out of the hands of the enemy. It was evident that both sides were using any means necessary to win the Civil War. Even with lack of provisions, this somber effort from both sides led to the civilians reacting by removing their advocacy for their side. The article continues with Southern civilians reacted with shock and fury to the actions of both armies, writing letters, holding public meetings, rioting, or even shooting at troops. The removal of support, especially from people back home, takes a toll psychologically, beginning to possibly question, what are we doing? Finally, we're going to be looking at the way to victory and how mobilizing was a winning factor. So a history of the Civil War era exhibit, portrays the Union's efficiency not only in implementing the railroad system, but protecting it. The exhibit states the Union Army possessed an apparatus that served the Federal troops well and with great efficiency, which prompted the Union to deploy an entire military detachment deployed to the rail lines to serve as protection. This serves as an example that while both armies were inexperienced, the Union implemented strong logistical procedures to ensure what was working for them would continue to thrive. While the exhibit adds, the Confederate troops often experienced issues pertaining to the coordination, organization, and delivery of supplies necessary to achieve success on the battlefield. Once again, comparing both armies' supplies and logistical procedures. Now, to conclude, we're looking at the overall analysis, the assessment of it all. So, by thinking that it is evident that these sources provide a vital sense that logistics and planning were crucial throughout the Civil War, they all have their unique perspective on both the Union and the Confederacy. The History Is Now magazine primarily focuses on the ineffective plans and lack of transportation to challenge their efforts. Both of the essential Civil War curriculum essays focus on both the North and the South's attempt to establish their provision centers. The Ohio State University study by Joan Cashin presents a completely different approach by focusing primarily on civilians, more specifically the civilians' expression of feelings during the war, with finally the exhibit displaying both sides' attempt to take advantage of their resources while presenting effective logistical planning. Some of these sources focus primarily on the government and military procedures, while others take an approach of political and social effects. The overall analysis of supplying the armies presents a new concern over the reason for the South's defeat. Was it primarily focused on financial pressure, as mentioned in some of the sources? Was it a lack of resources, as each source strongly recommended? Or was it a social and political shift over what the soldiers were doing? And these are all my citations. Thank you.